Thank you all very much, and welcome to the Dan Curran Place, a beautiful facility, beautiful out there. Last year, many of you will remember, we had the Eagle Landing. We set the deer up this year. I don't know if they're going to make it out or not, but we think they'll come out. But just a wonderful evening, and we're very appreciative of the University of Dayton for hosting the event, and wanted to invite Paul Benson, the provost of the university, up to say hello.
Thanks very much, Merle. It's wonderful to have you on the University of Dayton's campus. For those of you who don't live in the Dayton region, this is our River campus. It was the former world headquarters of NCR Corporation. And when NCR left Dayton, the university was fortunate enough to be able to acquire this property. Our main campus is about a mile east of here. The university has really been very honored to have a long-standing relationship with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. We were founded in 1850 by a religious order from southern France, the Society of Mary, one of whose educational pillars is to educate for service, justice, and peace. And that's a guiding light that still shapes the kind of educational community we attempt to create at the university. So we're especially delighted to be in a room of writers and readers who not only understand the power and beauty of language, but understand the transformational capability of great writing to open our imaginations to possibilities for reconciliation, human connection, and peace building. Thanks so much for being here. We're really very, very grateful to be able to host this event. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Wonderful to be here. And I also want to thank all of you to come, because the reason we can do this is because of the patrons like you. It's a wonderful opportunity for all of us, but we especially appreciate your support and the opportunity to participate and join us in it. I'd want to have a couple special guests. Looking for them. I want to notice Chris Surf. I see Chris. There's Chris. And Catherine Vaz. Chris and Catherine have been here for everyone. We just really appreciate their friends. They're part of the family now, and want to mention them. Just got myself Chris's new book, a bunk in the skunk in the bunk, skunk in my bunk. Yes. And Catherine's just come out with a multimedia book, I'm Drowning in My Heart, a collaboration with a painter and her poems on a Portuguese theme. So thank you both. Wonderful to have you here, and we really appreciate it. So good enough. Okay, and now I'd like to ask Sharon Rabb to come up and give a welcome. Sharon is the chair of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize.
Hi, welcome. It's so good to see you again, because with most of you it is again, and I so appreciate that. We all do. And of course, I'm here to talk about your opportunities. You saw your opportunities on your chair, perhaps. One of your opportunities is to join our membership of Fly with the Doves. This is a very important part of our calling. And what Fly with the Doves, for $25, for every $25 that you donate to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, we donate a book to a student or to a library of one of our winners. As you might remember, our first goal was to send a copy of every book of every winner, all 77 of them, to the Sarajevo library that burned in Sarajevo during the war. And we have accomplished that, and we will continue to send books to the Sarajevo library every year. But since we completed that, we have been able to give books to students, and we've been giving class sets, first of Wil Haygood's Tigerland, to students who came to the author series last year. This year, we gave classroom sets of What Have We Done by David Wood when he was here for the author series. So it's really, really important, because we honestly can't do this by ourselves. So we need your help, and you can join on our website. And for $25, you can give somebody a book. How wonderful is that? So your other opportunity is a little more expensive, okay? That's the $5,000 opportunity, okay? And, you know, I love that we jumped from $25 to $5,000. You know, here's your choice. On the other hand, fly with the doves, you can give as much as you want. Anyway, but if you join the Holbrooke Society for $5,000, you become part of our sustaining membership, and it is absolutely critical that we continue this, this partnership with the community. Those of you who have decided to make that donation on an annual basis, we absolutely appreciate it. And for that, you not only get evenings like this, but there are also special evenings that we have for the Holbrooke Society. We earlier brought George Packer in with his new book, Our Man, about Richard Holbrooke, for the Holbrooke Society only. And so that's the kind of benefit that you get if you join the Holbrooke Society. So that's all the opportunities I'm going to talk about, but I feel it would be remiss if I didn't mention them while you're here. Okay, and I thank all of you who have either donated to Fly with the Doves or who are Holbrooke members. It's critical to our mission. Thank you so much.
And Sharon's right, those steps do get steeper every year. I noticed that myself. So, and I want to mention one other thing. One of our prior winners here is Maaza Mengiste. Which I know because she spent a lot of time with me teaching me how to pronounce her name. But I especially did it because I saw on Twitter today that she posted a story about her mother's Beetle, Volkswagen Beetle, and I was telling her before we got on there that I too had a Volkswagen Beetle, and I will send a picture to her so she can share it with her mother. So now we're getting to the good part of the evening, and our host and moderator tonight is Gilbert King. Gilbert's a longtime friend of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize and a wonderful personal friend for almost all of us, many of us, and just wonderful. His books are Devil in the Grove and Beneath the Ruthless Sun, two of the most powerful books I've ever read. They're wonderful books, and Gilbert's a wonderful friend, and Gilbert will take over the leading of the panel discussion, for which we're all grateful. So, Gilbert?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I just had a deja vu. Like, is this like the third time I've done this? Fourth, maybe? I've been coming here for 7 years. It's so great to see so many of you friends, as Merle just said. I'm going to get right to the panel because you're here to hear them. So I'm going to introduce very quickly, because you have the bios in the pamphlets in the program, and it's just, you can look at the bios. Everyone, if I read every one of their bios, they're so extensive, it would be 15 minutes of time. We don't want to do that. So we're going to start out with N. Scott Momaday, 2019 winner of the Ambassador Richard C. Holbrooke Award for Distinguished Achievement. He's also the author of House Made of Dawn. And Scott, congratulations. Maaza Mengiste, 2011 Fiction Runner-up for Beneath the Lion's Gaze. She also has a new book out called The Shadow King. Right, who did I? Bob Shacochis, the 2014 winner in fiction for The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. Adam Hochschild, winner 2006 runner-up for nonfiction, Bury the Chains. Eli Saslow is the 2019 winner for nonfiction for Rising Out of Hatred. Wil Haygood, you recognize him, he's been here before, author of Tigerland, this year's nonfiction runner-up. It's, I'm going to read the whole title because it's important. Tigerland, 1968 to 1969, a city divided, a nation torn apart, and a magical season of healing. Wil Haygood. Golnaz Hagenshah, I'm sorry, I did this once before. Golnaz Bonde. I'm going to skip that part. That's terrible. I was practicing in the hotel room. It was perfect every time. She is the 2019 winner for Fiction What We Owe. Golnaz. And certainly not least, we will be going to, where did I do you? Richard Powers, 2019 Fiction Runner-up. Thank you very much, sir. Also want to introduce to you Moriel Rothman-Zechner. He is the finalist in fiction for Sadness is a White Bird. Are you here? Please stand up. There you are, sir. A Yellow Springs native, local. So we're going to start out with a couple questions, and then we'll go right down the line with the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience for the really good questions, as usual. First question, writing a book is usually a very long process. Research, writing, sometimes interviewing people. Many people takes years. Is there anything in your research and in your preparation for the books that you're currently working on, or the ones that you've won these awards for, that you would say surprised you, or that enlightened you in a way that you really weren't expecting when you began this process? I think we'll start out with Scott. Start out at the very end there.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Because I apologize, I'm not able to get my knees under the table because I'm in a wheelchair and I'm rather high, and it's not that I choose to look down on people. I have written 17 books, and all of them have been original to me. It's as if the second, third, and fourth, and so on were the first one. So there are not many surprises left for me when I write. I have a pretty good discipline, I think. I enjoy writing in the early morning. In fact, I must write in the early morning because that's when my juices are flowing. And by noon, I am exhausted. And so I have to turn to something else. So I spend about a 4-hour, 5-hour day writing. And I'm a painter as well, so it's very good for me to turn from writing to painting, as writing is such a concentrated activity, and I cannot watch a football game while I write or listen to one, but I can do that when I paint. So it's going from a state of high agitation to a state of relaxation. I spent my informative years at an Indian pueblo in New Mexico, and Housemaid of Dawn is based upon that experience. I knew a lot of young men who came back from the Second World War, and they were disoriented. They were trying desperately to get back into the traditional world, and they were having a terrible time. And that's the story of the protagonist in Housemaid of Dawn.
Wow, very good. Maaza, you want to give that a crack?
Sure. I've written 2 books, but the second one took such a long time. I will say, in terms of research, both the books are heavily researched. But the first one, which is set during a revolution in Ethiopia in the 70s, I could do basically a few drafts based on memory, based on what I had already experienced and what I knew happened in the revolution, and then I would go back and research and start pinning historical data and archival research to the memories that I had put into scenes. The second book, which is set in World War II and deals with Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, required a bit more extensive research. I had no memories of this. I lived in Rome, and I did my own research, my own archival work. And at some point, I had done so much work on that, and I had done a draft, and I could tell you almost everything about every single battle that I had written into this thing. The geography, the military maps that I had read, the maneuvers, the weather, everything. But the story that I had rendered from all that research was absolutely dry and boring and pretty terrible. And so I did something which surprised me in the process. I said, I'm going to do another draft, and I'm going to assume that I don't need to know anymore. And for this next draft, I am not going to break open any of my research files. And I am just going to write based on what I already think I know, but I'm going to let the characters lead me through this. Because the characters don't know about topography. They're just concerned about how to cross a river. And I did that entire draft and a few drafts, which became the book that's now published, without breaking into my archive. And I was really surprised. I don't know if it's how much I didn't need to know, but how much I didn't need to go back and look at some things, and things that I thought were important were not important to the characters, because it's a novel.
Right.
Yeah.
Mr. Shacochis.
Shahui? Shashmushish? I didn't even know I was supposed to be up here, so forgive me. Surprises. In a way, I'm like the venerable Mr. Momaday. I guess I'm too old to be that surprised by what I do. On the other hand, I am surprised that I research my fiction more than my nonfiction. And I don't know if that's good or bad. In a way, it's bad because it takes me so long to write my fiction. But that research also leads to surprises like, my God, I had no idea that this character who I'm working with was going to be in that embassy in Kenya during the Clinton administration when a terrorist blew it up. And that to me sounds like I've discovered a real fact, even though, of course, that's all in my imagination. The other surprise would be how much I hate finishing a book. And maybe that's why it takes so long to write one. But it's an awful feeling. Anybody who wants to congratulate me or celebrate the completion of something, I'm in mourning. I'm in mourning for all the wonderful research that I've just been living in. I've been mourning for the characters that I've imagined that really affect me emotionally. They are as important to me as, almost, I have to say, because if I say they're important to me as my wife and my dogs would be pissed, but they come close, so close that I grieve when I lose one of them, and I grieve when I lose a book, and you lose a book by finishing it. It's hard.
Well, since I write mostly about history, I'm having to deal with materials that people leave behind, letters, diaries, other documents. And what surprises me always and delights me is just how much people save, even though you would think they might not want to. I have a book coming out in March, which is basically a joint biography of a very unusual couple who lived in early 20th century America, who fell in love, and then about 20 years later they fell out of love and got divorced very bitterly, and they saved all their love letters, which most people do, but they also saved all their hate letters when they were getting divorced, accusing each other of the most terrible things. And I don't think they threw away a scrap of paper in their entire lives, which is wonderful for me because I can come along and then reconstruct this marriage out of it. Would I save all that much from my life? I don't think so. People save things that say more about them than they think they're saying. In the book I wrote about the King Leopold of Belgium and his conquest of the Congo, I quoted a number of diaries. One of the diaries was by a Belgian officer who was working in the Congo, who at one point described how he had ordered the execution of an African who'd been accused of stealing a rifle. And he congratulated himself in this diary on how he was able to order and then watch this execution without feeling slightly the least bit upset about it. Whereas when he had first arrived in the country 6 months earlier, he said he would have been up all night with nightmares had he seen such a thing. Here's somebody proudly recording his own brutalization. Does he have any idea with what eyes somebody might look at that 100 years later? For a book I'm working on right now, I'm spending a lot of time in the records of the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, in the years 1918, 1919. I've come across bureau agents who are proudly reporting to their superiors that they have gone and roughed up or arrested certain labor organizers whom they were told by the people at U.S. Steel were troublemakers in the strike that was affecting the company. Did they have any idea how somebody might be looking at that 100 years later, wondering why is the Bureau of Investigation doing the bidding of U.S. Steel rather than just trying to keep the peace? I don't know. So people save all kinds of material, which makes life great for writers of history, and all I can say is keep on saving it.
Go ahead, Eli.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I think for me as a journalist, in my reporting process, in my research process, which is mostly spending time, huge amounts of time with the people that I write about, if I'm not feeling constantly surprised, I start to get a little bit nervous. I think the best stories surprise us and tell us things that we didn't think or necessarily expect to think. And so my reporting process, I'm always hoping that it mirrors that. And also for the kind of journalism that I do, it's sort of more embedded journalism. If I'm writing about somebody who's being deported from the United States, I'm not just going to talk to them about that experience or talk to just experts about that experience. I'm going to go be there for their first weeks back in a lime field in Mexico when they're trying to figure out how to stay in touch with their kids who are still in the United States. Or if I'm writing about somebody in active heroin withdrawal, I'm going to be there to chronicle what it's like to be on that end of the opioid epidemic in the United States. So for this project, I was writing about the radical transformation of somebody who'd been raised to be the future heir to the white supremacist movement in the United States into now one of the most prominent anti-racists in the country. And I think the surprises for me in reporting this book were mostly how and who got him to the other side, which was basically, students, often students of color, Jewish students who'd been the victims of his prejudices again and again, who through really different tactics managed to impact his thinking. And that was through both civil resistance, students who made clear to him that his ideas were not okay, and also through outreach and discourse. And sometimes that outreach and discourse was coming from Jewish students on campus, students of color on campus who had every reason to be afraid, and yet still, even though this person had been dehumanizing them again and again, they found it in themselves to sit with him, to try to talk with him, to speak to them about their lives in the hope that he would begin to see the humanity. And I think, those tactics, their courage, and honestly their patience again and again was the surprise to me of this book.
Go ahead, Wil.
Hi. And there have been two of my books that have had a sports motif, and although they both have been about much more than the sports story at the heart of those two books. One was Sweet Thunder, about the life and times of the prize fighter Sugar Ray Robinson, and of course Tigerland. What's been interesting to me in my research is that I tend to write about people who have skills that I never remotely can come close to. And so there's great fear in writing about this boxer. I wanted to know how it felt to take a punch, about Sugar Ray Robinson. And I got into a recreation center in my hometown and asked somebody to hit me, and they did with a glove on. And the pain went from the top of my head all the way down to my tippy toes. And I said, okay, that's enough. One punch is enough. And so, and then with the basketball players in Tigerland, and I would go around the country to find them in Florida or Texas. Some of them, many of them still live here in the state. And it just so happens that my mother moved me to the east side of town and when I was 13 years old. And so these guys were 3 and 4 years older than me. And sometimes they would see me on the playground practicing. And about 4 of them told me that during the interview of me researching Tigerland, that they remembered me on the court and that they knew I was not going to make it as a top tier and as a top tier basketball player. And I'm sitting there with pen and paper, and I wanted to tell them, be careful now because I'm writing a book.
That's great. Go ahead, Golnaz.
Thank you. Well, I tend to, write first and research afterwards. Because what I write is what is within me and what I have observed or, what has been a meaningful experience in my life. So when writing this book, What We Owe, I wrote from memory, as Maaza said as well, a memory of things that, I hadn't experienced, the Iranian Revolution in particular, but that I've heard about my entire life. I didn't experience it, but I felt that I had actually been raised in it still, because the stories were so present in our home. So when I'd written it, the research part was kind of going back to make sure that what I'd written was correct and that I had represented the events and the people and the turns and twists in a good way. So I interviewed a lot of people. My both parents were dead at this point, so I interviewed friends of theirs in Sweden and in other parts of the world. And I think what surprised me, if that's the question, is how extremely meaningful it felt to listen to their stories. And actually, far beyond the point when I'd finished and knew what was correct and that this was represented in a good way, I just felt that it was important to listen and that not many people had asked them. And they had carried these stories for such a long time, very painful and traumatic stories that had actually shaped their entire personalities and lives for 30 plus years. And, I felt I was kind of bearing witness and that I needed to keep doing that as long as I could. I remember I found a book, a very thick book, and I don't really know how I found it. I don't think many people would have, have bought it, but it was like stories about individuals, maybe 30 stories about individuals in prison in Iran during the revolution, in the Evin prison, which is still a very political prison, and they would just, take a name and tell you what happened to this person. And it was an awful, awful book, and I really felt I have to read each story to the end. And I don't think, I won't keep doing this, but it felt very important during this process to really let all of these stories, pour on me, and especially the listening part.
Wow. Richard, I neglected to mention the name of your book, which is The Overstory. So,
right, and it's my 12th novel. I've been writing for a bit more than a third of a century, so like Mr. Momaday and Mr. Shacochis, I should be beyond surprise at this point. But for this book, which treats the deep, deep connection between humans and trees, I can honestly say that very few days went by where my mind wasn't blown by something that I was researching. Research is my favorite part of the whole writing process, and I continue to do it even after my editor has taken the manuscript out of my hands. And I wanted to emphasize that surprise can come in two flavors. It can come in the flavor of dismay, right? I'm utterly surprised and horrified by a fact that I've come across. And surprise can come in the form of exhilaration. I had no idea that this was in the world. This book was in a way a foot race between the surprise of dismay and the surprise of exhilaration. I will give you one example of each, or I'll give you a couple of the second, since it's it really propelled me along my way to discover things that I hadn't a clue about until I had reached the ripe old age of 55. Dismay. It absolutely knocked the wind out of me to learn that of the four great supposedly inexhaustible forests of North America that were intact when the Europeans came, from 95 to 98% of them are gone. That was a surprise, and it's a surprise that I haven't really wrapped my head around yet. On the exhilaration side, the discovery that trees send messages to each other over the air and alert each other preemptively to dangers, that they share resources underground, food and medicine, that a Douglas fir and a yellow birch can be sustaining each other in the forest through underground connection. That was an exhilarating surprise. And I would say the entire book, the 5.5 years of researching this book, was a daily pendulum between the dismay at what we've done to this place and the exhilaration at what life can take and continue to resist and come back from.
Wow. Great. That was applause for the whole panel, by the way. Next question is one I've asked before, but I always found that the answers are so interesting. You're all here because you've written words that have moved readers. And when you start out in publishing and as a writer, that's not always a guarantee. And so I'm just curious, having gone through these journeys of publishing and reaching people with your books, what advice would you give to your younger self at the start of that journey, knowing what you know now? I guess we'll start with Scott again.
Well, I guess I would say that I'm not sure what I'd say. I think that I would give some credit to the imagination. I have been accused in my younger days of being a realist. People say that, Scott, you're not really a realist, you're a romantic, as if that word were pejorative. And I say, now, I plead guilty. I am a romantic. And because I do rely so much upon the imagination, I put such faith in it. You know, I take it that the imagination is a way of seeing beyond reality. We see the mountain, but we imagine the valley on the other side. And on that mountain, there are things that are immediate and substantive. But in the valley, there are dreams. You know, there in the valley, there is Camelot. There is Shangri-La. There is the Garden of Eden. And it is those things that really attract my imagination and my desire to write. I just finished a piece. I'm writing a book called Dream Drawings. And these are very short pieces, no more than a page in length each. And I have now acquired about 60 of them, and I'm shooting for 100. But the most recent one has to do with the sinking of the Essex, the whaler, the Essex, the story of which some of you know. But the Essex was sunk in 1820 by a whale. Whale attacked it twice. The whale was apparently tormented and enraged. It sunk this ship, and the survivors endured one of the most terrible journeys in 3 whaleboats. And they suffered dehydration, they suffered starvation and exposure. And when they were rescued, those who did live through, they were more nearly dead than alive. One of them was a man named Owen Chase, who was the first mate on the Essex. And in his old age, he did return to Nantucket. And in his old age, he began to hide food in the attic of his house. And he was institutionalized. But what interested me about the story is that Moby Dick was based upon the sinking of the Essex. And I think that maybe Melville used Owen Chase as one of the models for the tormented and demented Ahab. And the final sentence I wrote for the piece is, when the mind is so deeply wounded, sanity is let go. So imagine, let's hear it for imagination.
Wow. Proves my theory that the dumbest questions lead to the best answers. Thank you. Maaza?
That's a really good question. I was thinking about it and still mesmerized by what you just said about the imagination. I have maybe 2 things. I think one of the things that I've learned in all the years of this work, it's something that I've written on a very, very tiny sticky note, and the sticky note now the sticky part doesn't work on my computer. So it's fallen on my desk, but I haven't thrown it away yet. And I wrote this note to myself at a point in this second book where I really did not think I was going to finish, that I was really worried that I just wasn't capable of writing the story that I wanted to write. And I wrote on this tiny slip of paper, give yourself space to fail. And I think that the minute I acknowledged that, I wrote it down, I put it on my computer, and then I said, you can fail and it's going to be okay. So what do you really want to do with this novel? How do you really want to tell it? This is that moment where I decided I'm not going to research anymore. I'm going to let the characters take over and just trust in the imaginative process. And that was one of the things I wish I had known a little bit earlier. Probably would have made the process a little shorter. But then it also makes me think about, and has made me think about, this question about writing and books, and what we do, and it's particularly what I am doing with the books that I'm writing. And I have written one book that's centered around revolution, and I've now finished another book, and that's centered around World War II. And I'm now moving into my 3rd book, which is the interwar years in Europe. So just between the end of World War I and right at what seems to be the beginning of World War II. And I keep going back to war. Because in some ways I find it fascinating. But recently a journalist asked me, who had read both of these books, and we were talking very briefly about this new project that I'm starting, and he said, well, why do you keep writing about war and death? He's like, don't you need a break from that? And I sat for a moment and I started thinking about all the questions I asked myself from book 1 to book 2 to book 3, and it hit me. And I said to him, actually, I'm not writing about death. I'm writing about life. And I'm writing about all those things that survive despite. And that was something I actually need to sit down and write that in my notebook, because that's a reminder to myself. I'm interested in what survives and what continues to survive despite everything we know that's happened in this world.
Great. Bob?
Okay, the question was, what would I tell myself? I don't know, because I think that I probably knew better back then than I know now. And it was fascinating, Scott, to hear you talk about mountains and the imagination. I don't think I ever had trouble with imagination and creativity, because I've spent, even though I know how to be an adult and I know how to be a journalist for Harper's Magazine and interview heads of state and, fake being an authoritative self, I've mostly lived the life of a 6-year-old. With an imaginary friends and imaginary worlds and imaginary grace and imaginary trauma and all those things. When Scott said, you look at a mountain and imagine the other side of it, a valley, my head takes me to another place. I think of my favorite Haitian proverb, and it's beyond the mountain. Do you know the answer? Beyond the mountain, more mountains. And I think that's how I've lived my life, because my parents could not bear the idea or could not grasp the idea that I was a writer. They would call me a professor or a journalist, but never a writer. They didn't understand that. What is that? And I'm not sure that I understood it that much either. I didn't, from their eyes, I didn't go to an office, I didn't get a paycheck, all these things that would stop rational people from wanting to be a writer. So it was always a mountain to climb, and I remember I was sure my parents never read my books until I was on the marquee at the Lincoln Center with Joyce Carol Oates, and we were both reading. And my parents said, wait, what is it you do, Bob? And damned if they didn't come in, damned if my father didn't talk through my whole presentation and reading. Hey, blah, 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 hey. Okay, Daddy. But telling my younger self, what I need to tell myself, what I would have told myself back then, because I was much more optimistic about the world, and need to tell myself now, is not to be bitter about things that don't go right. And certainly plenty has gone right in my life. And when things don't go right, to persevere. But I think I've always known to persevere. I think everybody up here has known that since we were young. We would not be up here if we didn't know that. So, Adam.
I think the main advice I would give my younger self is don't rush it. I started writing my first book when I was 25. It was a novel. I was totally entranced with the idea of being a writer. And in retrospect, I think that mattered to me a lot more than the feeling that I might have something to say. I worked on this novel for 4 years. I actually got an advance for it from a publisher. I finished it. I turned it in. To my total dismay, the publisher decided not to publish it. And I was convinced that a major felony had been committed against American literature. And as time went by, every once in a while I would pull this book out and look at it, and then I began to see why maybe somebody didn't want to publish it. And I think looking back on that, I was so eager to rush into the role of being a writer that I didn't stop and think, first of all, am I meant to be a novelist as opposed to a nonfiction writer, which is what I've turned out to be? Secondly, am I yet old enough to really have something to say? And I think I got distracted by that, the wish to have the role rather than actually to have something to say. So after that, I reverted to my previous occupation as a journalist, and then I didn't actually publish my first book until I was 43, by which point I think, in retrospect, I finally did have something to say. So that's the main advice to young Adam. Don't rush it.
I guess this is the advice for my younger self and my now self and my future self, because I'm sure I'll always need it. But it's basically just if I continue to have the privilege to try as much as possible not to pay too much attention to the outside noise or to what publishers think will necessarily sell or even what editors think people will read, but to try to do work that is mattering to me every single time that I do it, because even if the results of that are not what I would hope for, that will never feel to me like a waste of time.
Oh, that's great.
There's something that stands out in my mind, but in order, to fix that moment, Gil, as far as what I would do, and I'd almost have to have superpowers, because when I was 8 years old, my aunt Bertha in Cincinnati knew how much I wanted and to travel out of state. There wasn't a car in my family, and we had never been out of state. And so she told me, she said, well, next summer, and we're going to Georgia to visit in the family farm that's been in the family all these years. And I begged my mother to let me go to Georgia with my Aunt Bertha next summer. And my mother said, maybe I'll let you go, as long as you be good during the school year. And so I was extra good, and I got a chance to go to Georgia. And one day, my aunt got up and said, and I'm gonna take you into town with me. And so, now this was before the 1964 Civil Rights Bill passed. And so we're walking down the street, and there's a particular store that I wanted to go into. And my Aunt Bertha said, well, and we can't go in there today. And I wondered why, and like a little boy, I sulked and told her, I thought that we were gonna have fun, that store back there, and I wanted to go in that store. And finally, a few days later, my cousin, her older son, Willie Grover, explained to me that blacks couldn't go into that store until on the weekend, but not during the week. And so if I would have had superpower skills, and I'm sure, and I would have been back in the car with a notebook. You know what I mean? Writing those things that happen and that look on my aunt's face, you know, about, you know, her having to hold my hand and scoop me past that store. She, thank goodness, is still with us, still in Cincinnati, and I visit her as often as I can. But you know, those moments. If I knew I was going to become a writer, and I think I would have carried notebooks and pens around with me.
Sounds like you didn't need a notebook, though. You got that story perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, Golnaz, go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that story. Well, I'm in the process of writing my third book, and I must say I feel in greater need of, you know, advice than being in a position of giving anyone, even myself, any. But I think there is one thing that is key and that will continue to be key, and that's everything that I've written that has been published in different forms has come, you know, as I said before, from my inside, from what I really feel strongly about, or mainly just want to investigate. I write to find answers to questions that I carry. But I have had issues with, you know, not wanting to be categorized. So I don't want to be a female immigrant writer and like have all the workshops I attend have the word immigration in its topic, or always be asked those kinds of questions, you know, because I feel that the characters I write about, let's take Nahid in What We Owe, you know, this is written in the Swedish context, and when I went to that year's Swedish book fair, as I said, all the workshops were about immigration or racism or other things. And I would say, but Nahid is Swedish. You know, she's lived here for 30 plus years. Our population is 1% Iranian. They carry these stories. So why do we always have to keep them, you know, as a subcategory and not as a part of the whole? And so to kind of not end up there, I've tried to write other things. I have imagination. I try to come up with ideas and stories and characters, and they do stuff, but it's totally uninteresting to me, you know? So I'm like, bah, you know, I let it go, and I go back to my own stuff. And I think this is something that I kind of need to come to terms with. Not fighting it, and kind of having trust in that eventually even Nahid's story will be a part of the general one, and keep telling what's important and necessary and even unavoidable to me.
One thing I learned as a young man from reading a lot of science fiction is that these time travel send a message back into the past stories rarely work out the way that you want them to. I was 21 years old when I first started to write novels. There is so much I would love to tell that man. It's not a competition. It's not a race. You're not in charge. He would listen to almost nothing, I'm sure, that I would have to say. I think the only bit of advice that I've learned as an old man that he would be at all sympathetic to is something I recently learned from Tom McGuane, who said he learned it from William Golding. Remember, nobody knows anything about anything.
That's great. We're going to open it up to the crowd here, see if any questions can come up. We'll start as a custom. Awesome.
So as we stand on the cusp of a new decade, and we're in an age of so many sources of stimulation and a lot of mediums of expression, do you ever feel like you're competing for attention from your readers with all of these distractions? And do you ever feel like your book and all of these distractions are competing for your attention? And how do you power through and train your muscle of focus? And how do you keep an art, the art of reading and writing, which requires so much focus and discipline in an age that can sometimes feel so unfocused? And the internet is right next to your what you're typing usually. So I can't handle the temptations of Instagram even. So how do you I guess and is this something you're concerned about in as we advance,
Sure.
Yeah.
Anybody want to
Or
tackle that
regress,
one?
I don't know.
Oh, thanks, awesome. Anybody want to tackle that one? Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Well, I think it helps, actually, if you're not very good at technology. Yesterday, just before I went away, my wife said, would you show me how to turn on that DVD player? Because the grandkids were coming over, they might want to watch a movie and so on. The two of us spent 5 minutes, and you know how you have these big setups and they're 3 or 4 different controllers, and we were trying to figure out if they want to watch a Netflix film, how do we get Netflix on there and which controller? After 5 minutes, we both gave up and said, well, they'll probably know how to do it. So that makes it a little easy for me not to get too distracted by these things. I'm not on social media, I'm not on Instagram, Facebook, so on. And if I'm not on there, then I'm not interested in seeing whether anybody else is getting more likes than I am or whatever, so I don't look at that stuff at all. Now, the internet is a problem because it does pop up there right next to the text of whatever I'm working at. And I do sometimes get distracted by that, but I tend to blot out the other stuff. I don't use a cell phone. I have to take one with me on a trip or something, so I'll be able to call home, but otherwise I don't carry a cell phone around. I think you just have to work at not being, it's like any other kind of addiction. You have to not expose yourself to the temptation too much. Otherwise, you can't get any work done.
Okay. Anybody have anything to add about that?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eli.
Well, yeah, I worry about it like you do, and frankly, I think we all should. And I also fall into the same traps of keeping my phone by my bed and suddenly checking my text messages or the Broncos score or whatever is distracting me at that moment. I would also say it's not a small thing, right? This is a big part of our biggest societal problems right now as a country and as a world. We're becoming increasingly polarized. We cultivate our own news feeds on our phones through all of these apps. Rates of loneliness in parts of the country are up beyond what they've been before. Suicides are up. We're more fractured and disconnected from other people than we've been. And I think that actually I try to use as a reminder that this kind of work, and not just doing it, but consuming it, is more important than ever before, because we have to find ways still to learn about people's experiences of the world that are different from our own. That's harder to do than it used to be in some ways. And I think actually through reading, through fiction, through writing, that's one way to do it. So I just always try to make time for it, and sometimes leave my phone downstairs when I'm going to bed.
That's great. Yeah, the question over there. Oh, Scott's got something.
Yeah, I was going to say that I have found that writing is itself a way of overcoming distraction. When I moved to Tucson, I taught at the University of Arizona for a time, and when I moved to Tucson, I had never been on the apron of the Sonoran Desert before, and I had heard stories about the heat in Tucson. These stories were all true. 3 months out of the year, you want to leave Tucson and go to cooler climes. But in the summer, I discovered the distraction of swimming, and I swam laps. It's terribly boring to swim laps. It's more boring than jogging because at least you have a change of scene when you jog. But you're in a pool and you're looking down at the black stripe, and you're going back and forth, back and forth. So I found that a way to overcome this distraction of boredom by composing epitaphs as I swam. And I have 2-lap epitaphs, 4-lap epitaphs. And I'll give you an example. Here's a 2-lapper that I composed without benefit of pencil and paper and while I was completely wet. It's called The Minor Writer. Certainly it was suicide. He read himself until he died. and I have one which is maybe my favorite called On Chastity. Here lies a lady sweet and chaste. Here lies the matter. Chaste makes waste.
Wow. You had a question, sir? Yeah.
Yes. First, I'd like to say that Golnaz, that I just finished your book about 3 hours ago, and I'd like to discuss it, but the wound is still deep, and I thank you very much for that. It was very well written. But Eli, my question is, Rose was a central character at the early part of the book, and in the end, you thanked almost all of the other characters for that. And I'm wondering if Rose was an amalgam or why you didn't thank her. And my second part of my question is, did you have to shower after talking to the David Duke and Don Black?
Yes, I do have to shower all the time, but yeah. I mean, I think so. Thanks for the specific question about Rose. So she was the one person in the entire book who decided she didn't feel comfortable having her real name used. That it's her middle name. For the people who are in the book, as always, sort of in a reported work of nonfiction, like the real risk is on their end, and particularly in this book, it was again, a lot of people of color, Jewish students like Rose, who did the work of some of them, ostracizing Derek or befriending this person to begin this transformation. And by making the choice to put their names in the book, that was like a big risk for them. And it's a risk that has not always worked out well for them. I think I had discussions with all of those people during the reporting about what likely might happen when their names were in the book. But everyone, except Rose, whose decision I totally understood and respected, everyone else said, like, no, I want my full name to be in there. All of the other things I've lost to being on the wrong end of this country's, awful white supremacist history and present, I don't want to sacrifice my role in this story to that too. So they wanted to put their names in the book. Yes, reporting and spending time with current white supremacists was a sometimes frightening and unpleasant part of this work. They would ask questions about my last name and the Judaism in my family and things like that. I also knew that it was essential if I was going to be writing about the ways that they had worked to mainstream these ideas in our political space and also on the radical fringe. I needed to understand the tactics, and I needed to hear about the ways that they'd done that. So it was a necessary part of the reporting process. I tried to take smart precautions, but mostly knew it wouldn't be a good book without it. Thanks for asking.
Hi. I am very aware of what it means to be a woman artist. I was very intrigued by your being put in a box or, attending seminars or things in which you are spoken of as an immigrant, a woman immigrant. And I wanted to address that and talk about why it's so very difficult. I'm a Kiowa woman. I'm a filmmaker, and the film industry is very much a man's world. I wanted to address both Maaza and Golnaz. How do we get around those things? Because it's very important for women artists, writers, any kind of voice that you have. How do you address that? I'm finding, you know, that there is one thing that I wanted to say. In the Native American world, there is many, many missing and murdered indigenous women, and that is a huge thing in our country right now, and I don't know if even people are aware of that, but we are. And I would love for both of you to address that, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I've carried with me always. I also, I mean, I have a business background. I work in business, and when I was young, I was successful, and then I was, you know, the female immigrant business person. So I've had this with me throughout my life, and especially, I guess, you know, in areas which is almost every area where females and immigrants are not very, you know, represented. But I think you just have to be kind of like a friendly bulldozer, you know? Just keep telling your story. With What We Owe, I mean, to me, it's a book about what is inherited between generations and about a mother-daughter relationship, okay, which are very general themes and are often also recognized by its readers as a very general theme, right? So it's not as if it's only female refugees who connect to the themes. And when I have the opportunity to talk to readers or even address the title of a seminar, you know, I will always do that. And I will say, this is a general story. And of course, my experience of, you know, being a refugee 33 years ago shapes how this is told. And that's not unessential. I mean, that's something that I'm bringing to the table. So it's not that I don't value the experience, but it's only a nuance added to a much bigger story. So I just bring it up, and I talk about it, and I try to shift the perspective whenever I can.
Yeah, thank you for that, Golnaz, and thank you for this question, because it's something that we are forced to confront and deal with all the time. If you are a woman, and then if you're a woman of color, and I've had, initially when my first book came out, and my first book is set in Ethiopia, my second book is set in Ethiopia and flashes back to Italy, and has nothing to do with migration, and has nothing to do with any of those experiences. Some of my main characters are Ethiopian, some of them are Italian, they are soldiers. That's just what I have written. And so when I would find that I would be put on panels about writing the immigrant experience or writing as an immigrant. And it took me a little while before I realized, wait a minute, I don't have to do this. And what I have started doing now is emailing those panel coordinators or the festival directors and saying, I will not be on this panel because this is what I write about. I can talk about research, I can talk about archival, I can talk about you know, the wars that, you know, aren't there other panels that deal with topic as opposed to identity? And often they have agreed. Sometimes they'll say, well, we'll change the panel title, and let's just have all of you writers talk about whatever you'd like, or, you know, and that has worked. There have been a couple of instances where they got very angry and they didn't want to do it, and I said, thank you, I am uninviting myself. But I think that what happens in this, and maybe this goes for everyone who thinks about designing panels, is that the people who are designing the panels think that this is what an audience wants. And the audience thinks, well, this is the only thing that this writer can really talk about. And then it goes, and then the writer is caught in a bind and is really the one that's, everyone's losing out in that case. So I think more writers need to speak up, and panelists need to say, okay, just because this woman is African or whatever, maybe she can talk about World War II with a white man. So, but in terms of the second part of your question with the numbers of disappearances and murders of indigenous women and girls, which we do not talk about in this country. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I have just been reading Highway of Tears, which came out in Canada, and it's set in British Vancouver. It's a nonfiction book that is, I believe, a bestseller there, and it's going to be published in the United States. And it's a story of these girls who have disappeared over decades, and nobody talks about it. And for those families, most of their questions are still unanswered. And this writer has grew up in that community and has been talking to the families of those girls and is making their stories heard. So that might be a book that you're interested in, and it's coming out in November. But thank you, because I didn't know very much about it, and this book is shaking me awake. Yeah.
I have some questions for you, Maaza, and for you. Good faith questions, I hope you feel. When you say we don't talk about something, I'm not sure what you mean by that, and you could just reflect on that while I ask the other question. In the situation you described with people who are organizing panels, there would be a big difference between somebody who is doing that with bad faith or who is just doing it without any understanding that somebody might have an objection to how they're doing it. When you asked your question, what should we do about this? I understand why you only wanted to ask the women up here, but why didn't you want to ask the men? Do we have nothing that's important to you?
You don't get asked the same things.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think?
Indigenous women of color, because, and truly.
What should the men be asked?
Well, this is a question for everyone. It's
the men
not
get asked about their work. Sorry to cut you off.
No, it's okay.
The men get asked about the content of their work and what they are writing about, and we end up getting asked questions about identity or womanhood in the process of writing, and no one, I'm making blanket statements, but we don't get asked questions that deal very specifically about the nature of our work or the ideas, about the imagination that you're talking about. And I can't say very rarely, because it's gotten much better, I think, in some ways, but it's part of the reason it's gotten better is I've had to tell my publishing company, do not send me to places without talking to them and telling them that I don't want to talk about what it is to be an African, but what it is to be a researcher or a novelist who does research is a different thing. But yeah.
You know, I think my dad could speak on this, being Native American, and his, how it was for you, Dad.
I'm a feminist. I'm very proud of my daughter. She's a strong person and a warrior. And she, I'm reflecting on why she didn't ask the men on the panel. And I think it's because men are inferior to women.
I would agree.
They're probably not as articulate. So, is there something you wanted me to say, Jill?
We do come from matriarchal societies, and there's something to be said about woman warriors, for sure. But no, really, it's not just for women. It's for, it's a universal question for everyone. But married to an artist. I was married to an artist. I'm divorced now. Apache, full-blooded Apache, an incredible painter, artist, and he always got boxed into, you are an Indian painter, you are an Indian artist. Now, how many of you are an Hungarian writer, you are a, it doesn't matter. People who are not of color don't get boxed into that category. That's all I meant. And so I was addressing the women because I'm a woman and I was interested. But it's really a question for everyone and everybody's voice and art, etc.
Yes, and I'm interested too. It's really important for you to understand that you and Maaza and Golnaz to understand I'm interested. And when you say, well, people don't talk about women on the res disappearing, well, I don't agree with that. People who care talk about it all the time. In New Mexico, I am surrounded by 3 reservations, 3 different tribes. People talk about it all the time. If you care about the women on the res, you damn well talk about it, and you do what you can. But it's not news to you. Most people don't give a shit, do they? How do you make them do that? I have no idea. And with an artist who doesn't like, an Apache artist who doesn't like being described as an Apache, I'm also interested in how many Apache artists would prefer that they weren't described as Apache artists. I don't know the answer to that. I just know that it's really complex, isn't it?
It's very complex, and it's not that he doesn't want to be.
He doesn't like to be boxed.
Painter, he's very proud of being
Absolutely.
We're all proud of who we are, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Where we come from
Yeah.
in our own identities.
Right.
But to be boxed in and just
Right.
talked of in that way is very limited.
You bet.
This is turning out to be a great panel. Anybody? Yes, sir, right back there.
Hi, I was wondering where you saw the concept of peace fitting into your stories. Was it an intention? Was it something that occurred to you as you wrote, or maybe an afterthought? And how does it feel having your work honored for your efforts in peace?
Anybody want to jump on that one?
I, for one, am greatly honored and certainly appreciative. I'm going to say that again tomorrow night, but it's a fine experience for me and for my daughter. I'm glad to be here, and means a great deal to me. And and something occurred to me a moment ago. You're talking about native artists and so on, and being put in a box. I was at one time, I think I've outgrown it, but I think I was at one time accused of being a Native American artist, Native American writer. And that term doesn't mean much, does it? It's what you do that really matters. And I thought for some reason, I was reminded of a film I once saw called 1492. And in that film, I think it was Gerard Depardieu, played Columbus, and when he returned to Spain at some point and had been disfavored, a lackey came up to him and said, well, we're pretty much alike, you and I, aren't we? And Columbus said, well, yes, but there is one difference. I did it, and you didn't. I like that.
Wow. Anybody else want to add to that?
One of the important things in this book, and that I've written, Tigerland, is that after this all-black high school won 2 state championships in the 1968-69 season, making national history, 2 state championships in the same year, school teachers and parents started having meetings about, all right, we're very proud of what in this all-black high school just did, but why is the high school still all black? Why is the high school not getting the type of funding in that New Albany schools get, or the Upper Arlington schools get. And so they brought in 2 NAACP lawyers from New York City, and they finally said, well, we're years away from the Thurgood Marshall 1954 Brown decision. The school should be integrated, so let's sue the school system. So they did. And this case was heard by a federal judge. The federal judge's name, Robert Duncan. Robert Duncan came out of school in 1954 and wanted to get a job in Columbus, Ohio. Because he's black, he was sent to East High School. There were no openings, so he couldn't teach. So he went to law school. Years later, this case winds up on the desk of Robert Duncan. And the first words out of his mouth were, I want everybody to know that I intend to be very fair. And then he lowered the boom and said the school system has been unlawfully segregated. And then the city of Columbus appealed that decision all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And they ruled in Robert Duncan's favor, and East High School is mentioned in that decision, which was an astonishing moment to go through all of those steps and to see how these teams inspired legal activism, and because that decision was written about on the editorial page of the New York Times and at the time. And so it was a big decision that was rooted in those black boys winning those 2 state championships who inspired their parents and school teachers to say, okay, it's great that we won against all these odds, but still, we still have raggedy school buses, and the school still doesn't have funding that it should have.
Great. Yes, go right ahead, Golnaz.
I just wanted to say that when I was writing this book, I wasn't at all thinking about peace in the sense, in the general sense. But what I wanted to do was to create an unlikable character and evoke empathy for her. And that's kind of what the book is about, empathy for even the unlikable ones. And being awarded this Peace Prize is a big honor, and it's kind of shows me that I managed to do that.
Wow, very good. I think we have time for one more question, so let's do right here.
Hi, my name is Amaria. I'm a first year at UD, and I just wanted to know, when did you allow yourself to become like a full-time writer, or when did you like fully invite writing into your life? And I also wanted to know, when did you allow yourself to be vulnerable, like to share your truths with the world as well as like other people's truths through journalism?
Eli, you got something to say on that one?
Sure. I guess I hear journalism. It's like, oh, it's my turn. I mean, although I think in some ways I'll be really curious to hear other people's answer to when they decided to become a writer. I think for me, I realized, and I was fortunate to realize relatively quickly, I guess I'd say late in college, that there were a lot of other things that I wasn't good at, so my options were being limited. And then I started to realize that journalism there was a way in which journalism could be about the people. And my job actually is, while of course every story that I'm driven to tell comes out of my own truth and the things that I care about, my work is always, and I would say explicitly, not about me. I'm trying to, as much as possible, build enough trust with people, spend enough time with them, have them share their emails, their most intimate parts of their lives, and usually at very vulnerable moments with me. And I'm trying to do that so that I can create enough intimacy, enough empathy for a reader to hopefully, in the best case scenario, in the best version of narrative journalism, to feel like they are seeing something for themselves. They have like a direct view into what's happening in somebody's life. So while I know that of course I'm every part of what goes into the work comes out of me and the way I see the world, and it would be dishonest to say anything else. I also am trying to make it so that the work is about the people that I'm writing about. And I think when I figured out that I could do that, that's when I realized journalism was, and this kind of journalism was what I wanted to do. Thank you for asking.
Adam, you have something.
I think those are good questions, and it's really two separate questions, at least for me. The first, when did you decide to be a writer, and when did you decide to share your own vulnerabilities? For me, they were two different points. I always wanted to be a writer from the moment that I graduated from college, and so I plunged right in. And I mentioned in answering an earlier question that in my 20s I wrote a novel. But I think the part of the problem was that I wasn't sharing my responsibility, my vulnerabilities. I was more entranced with the idea of being a writer, and it wasn't until I finally published my first book when I was 43, which is still the book I'm most fond of. It's a memoir where I think I did explore my vulnerabilities, which was something I could not have done when I was 25. So that's why I say they're two different questions, and for me the answers came at two different points in my life.
Richard, yeah.
There was something in the way that you phrased the question that was really attractive to me. I won't be able to remember it exactly, but you said something like, when did you first give yourself permission to be a writer? And it was so lovely because you reminded me of that long process from when I first said, I love to do this, to the moment where I first started to say, I might be able to do this. And I would say I went from about 16, where I was impassioned by writing, until 21, when I thought, I have to do this. But I wanted to add two things about this giving permission to yourself to be a writer. That has had to be perpetually renegotiated for me over the course of 35 years. Every time I start a new book, I have to give myself permission to start again. Also, every time I wake up in the morning and it's a writing day, I have to say, this is okay. I mean, I feel like I'm getting away with something, but I can do this.
That's great.
I feel the same.
Go ahead,
There's no
Golnaz.
guarantee. You sit down in front of the paper, it's blank, or the screen, it's blank, and there's no guarantee it will have anything worthwhile after 8 hours.
Good.
I wanted to be a writer from, when I could read. Yeah, it was always a dream, because I also enjoyed writing a lot. And I think, I dare say, I felt I had a voice and something to say quite early as well. But then I was brought up by parents who had left everything and, came empty-handed to a new country, built up a new life, and of course, they wanted security for me. So my father was always like, writing is fun. You can do it on your spare time, but an education, proper education that can bring in money, that's what you're gonna do. And of course that voice was very, loud and important in my head. So I wanted to be a writer, I had things to say, and I gave myself permission to start the day I graduated from business school.
Oh, wow. That's great. That's great. Scott.
I've been waiting for two questions to be asked. One of them is it difficult to write? I heard a person on the radio asking a writer that. Do you find it difficult to write? And there was a pause, and then the writer said, oh, no, no. All you do is put a piece of paper in the typewriter, and you look at it until beads of blood appear on your forehead. And the other question was, who do you write for? And William Gass was asked that question, and he replied, well, I certainly don't write for myself. That would be self-serving. I don't write for a readership because that would be pandering. I write for the thing that is trying to be born. I've always taken inspiration from that.
I think that's the perfect place to end up. Thank you all for coming out today. I think the writers are going to be signing books in the lobby, correct? And so if you want to meet and maybe you have a question that you wanted to ask personally while you're getting your book signed, do that. But another big hand for this great panel. Thank you all.